At that point, I stopped and say, "I don't know," and give it to Jeremy.
Thanks, Colin. I was actually worried I wouldn't have very much time to describe the bigger project since we wanted to get into the art and science collaborative slideshow, but it turns out we have plenty of time. So I'll tell you guys about the bigger project, which is called East Jemez Landscape Futures. Rather than saying that over and over again, we abbreviate it as ELF with the silent Spanish J. So ELF, East Jemez Landscape Futures. This idea really grew out of conversations that Colin and I and some of our colleagues started having probably in 2015. So I got here in July of 2015, and that was 4 years post Las Conchas, 2 years after the big floods and that damaged Frijoles Canyon, Santa Clara. I mean, you guys are familiar with all of that. And the park at that time had really been working hard to get the park back open. Most of our energy was focused on trying to rebuild infrastructure that had been damaged, rebuilding bridges and trails and parking lots and making the park safe to visit again. So sometime in 2015, we started wrapping those projects up. And so those of us in resource management science started thinking, well, what do we do next? What do we do about this entire landscape that's been altered significantly, and it's such a big issue that nobody really knows how to get started, right? I mean, you got 300,000 acres of land that have been impacted by high severity fire just in the East Jemez alone. 60% of Bandelier was burned just in Las Conchas, and so being the kind of government wonk that I am, I thought, well, if we're going to plan something, we should do a NEPA analysis and come up with some alternatives and have some public meetings. But again, where do you start? Where do you start trying to work not just on Bandelier, but on this entire massive landscape that's changed so much in the past 40 years? And so the route we came up with was to step back, hold off on the NEPA planning part of it, and actually not just come up with our own ideas, but to go out to the public. I mean, normally, I don't want to sound critical of the government NEPA process, but usually it works kind of like this. I work for the government, so I come up with a range of ideas that I think are good for some project. And then I come out to the public and tell you guys what we plan to do, and you give us feedback, and we negotiate some changes, but usually don't start with the public's ideas first. And so East Jemez Landscape Futures was really an effort to go out to the public and all the stakeholders before we even started down the road of planning and find out what people thought were possible, what people thought was appropriate, what you wanted to see from us as federal employees, and we tried to capture as many different groups of people as we could. So we talked to people from academia, other federal agencies, Forest Service, BLM, Nature Conservancy. We talked to local tribes, members of the community. Some of you in the room here might have actually been interviewed as part of that process. But we actually interviewed, I don't know how many people, dozens and dozens of people from over 60 organizations, and used those interviews to compile a needs assessment and looking for patterns where people were talking about how they'd like to see the landscape be restored, or what was most important to them as a community member, or as a tribal member, or as a scientist. And so ELF is really an effort to start to get a handle on this uncertain future and trying to encourage not just the Park Service, but all of our colleagues and other federal agencies and outside of the park boundaries to work together to come up with ideas for how to restore the landscape, conduct research to help understand these changes that we're still uncertain about. And as part of that, as Colin pointed out, we also didn't want to just focus on science and research. We wanted to engage that segment of society that may not come listen to guys like me who have public meetings and talk about NEPA. I can tell you we've had a few public meetings recently and I didn't get a crowd like this. It may also be that there's wine here. But, I mean, science is incredibly important, as anybody in this town knows, but not everybody has the interest in science to bring them out to events like this. And so we really saw art as a way to reach another segment of society that may not come out to a science talk or may not read a white paper or read a research project, but might come out and learn about these issues through art. And so here in just a minute, I think we'll get a chance to jump in and talk about, I'm going to talk a little bit about how government has supported art in the past, and then I'm going to pass it back to Colin to talk about some projects he's been involved in that we drew inspiration from, and also the direction we're going in with this project. Can you guys see that screen at all? No. Problem number 2.
Is there a shade or a shade over here? Not really. So here, I'll keep going.
If you turn it, then there you go. That's a little better. You can at least see it.
We tried that, it didn't help.
That's better. You wanna move it back this way and make it larger?
Well, that-
Might raise it up.
If 7 or 8 people would just stand along that wall.
Well, does it, like after that sort of
Here's some things to raise it.
halfway coherent introduction, are there questions? Are there interests, comments, suggestions? Is this, yeah, go ahead.
What are the boundaries of the East Havens area? What does it encompass?
Yeah, so it's, right now it's kind of, it still is a little bit amorphous because it's, there's no definitive project boundaries, but what we did was take the high severity fire of the last 30 years and then couple that with some of the drought and the flood impacts of the last 10, and you get an area that's about 300,000 acres. So it's essentially the whole eastern third of the Jemez Mountains. So basically from Peralta Canyon and then wrapping all the way around to Santa Clara Canyon and then coming down onto the plateau. So it's a pretty huge area. And obviously a project like this wouldn't be undertaking that entire thing, but subsetting it up and going after a few specific projects. So one project that we've identified is really working in Frijoles Canyon, so up from the headquarters of Bandelier. And then a couple other options, maybe trying to get something started out just on the hills here outside of Los Alamos. And then, Peralta Canyon is another opportunity, because what we're looking for ecologically is areas where there's a little bit of that ecological capital, where it didn't all burn up or it didn't all get flooded out. You can kind of take that and then spread out. So that's a starting point to spread out. So Peralta Canyon is one of those places where there still is a nice riparian area, but still some intervention may be necessary. And Frijoles Canyon is similar. And then these places outside of Los Alamos are an area where some intervention has been tried, replanting, reforestation, and that